The night my mother discovered my father and me together altered everything. It wasn't a fleeting glance or a lingering look. She caught us in a moment of undeniable intimacy. We believed we were alone, our secret safe, but the creaking door shattered that illusion, revealing her shocked and betrayed expression. In that instant, our world imploded. Growing up, my bond with my father was unique, special. We were inseparable, the quintessential father-son pair, from weekend fishing trips to late-night conversations. He was my constant, my unwavering support. I believed that's what fathers were meant to be, dependable, present, always there. At least, that's what I thought. My mother, however, was different. While she loved us in her own way, she was often distant, more a figurehead than an active participant in our lives. Her demanding career kept her away, and even when present, she seemed preoccupied, her mind elsewhere. My father would excuse her absences, attributing them to fatigue or work stress. For years I accepted his explanations, but as I matured the truth became clear. She wasn't truly present, not in the ways that mattered. And my father, always the steadfast one, stepped in to fill the void. Unknowingly, that void laid the groundwork for everything that followed. One evening we sat together in the living room, the air cool, the silence comfortable and familiar. I can't recall what we were watching. It was inconsequential. What mattered was the way he looked at me. It wasn't the first time I'd noticed that intensity, but this time it lingered. A soft yet intense gaze, as if he were seeing me anew, or perhaps I was finally noticing him. My heart raced inexplicably. "Dad, what?" I asked, attempting nonchalance, but my voice wavered, betraying my unease. He smiled, a smile that usually brought comfort, but now only amplified the tension. "Nothing," he replied, turning back to the television. But moments later, his gaze returned to me. I could feel it without even looking. And strangely, instead of discomfort, I felt a warmth, a sense of being seen that I craved, especially in a house where my mother's attention was often absent. My father made me feel important, like I was the only person in the room. As time passed, these moments became more frequent, charged with an unspoken energy. We danced around something we both sensed but neither dared to address. It began subtly, a lingering touch, a glance held a moment too long, the way he sat a bit closer than necessary. Each instant sent my heart racing, the feeling lingering long after the moment passed. Then one night, everything changed. I was heading upstairs after dinner when my father called out, "Hey, can you come here for a second?" His voice was calm, yet held an unusual undertone. He sat on the couch, a glass of wine in hand, the dim light casting shadows on his face. He was silent, just looking at me with that familiar intensity, as if waiting. "Sit down," he said, patting the cushion beside him. I hesitated, then sat, feigning composure despite my pounding heart. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken tension. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and steady. "I've noticed things have been different between us lately." My stomach tightened. I had no idea where this was leading, and I wasn't sure I was ready. "What do you mean?" I whispered. He took a deep breath, setting down his glass. "I don't know how to explain it," he said, "but I think you feel it too." The unspoken truth hung heavy in the air. I should have denied it, pretended ignorance, but I couldn't lie to him. I nodded slowly, my throat constricting with emotion. "Yeah," I whispered. "I feel it." We sat in silence, the tension almost unbearable. Then, he reached out and placed his hand on mine. A simple gesture, one he'd done countless times before. But this time, it felt different, charged with meaning. My breath hitched, but I didn't pull away. It felt wrong, yet I couldn't deny the feeling it evoked. From that moment on, everything changed. It wasn't immediate, but gradually we spent more time together, seeking excuses to be alone, late-night talks on the porch, quiet moments in the car. There was always an unspoken connection, a tension that quickened my pulse. I tried to dismiss it, too. I tried to convince myself it was a phase, a temporary infatuation, but the more I resisted, the stronger the feelings grew. And it wasn't just me. My father felt it too. I saw it in his lingering glances, the way his hand rested on my shoulder a moment too long, the seemingly innocent touches that spoke volumes. Soon, those innocent touches evolved into something undeniable, something we both craved. From that night on, the atmosphere in our home subtly shifted. Every interaction with my father carried a new weight, an unspoken tension. I became hyper-aware of his presence, constantly feeling the undercurrent of something significant brewing between us. It was a slow burn, a flame ignited but not yet fully ablaze. Still, the heat was palpable. My mother, as usual, remained distant, absorbed in her own world. Work and social obligations consumed her, leaving her a mere ghost in our home. Our conversations were shallow, perfunctory exchanges about mundane topics. An invisible wall separated us, one I felt powerless to dismantle. My relationship with her had always been strained, but I hadn't realized how much until my father's attention began to fill the void. One evening, weeks after our conversation on the couch, my father and I were alone again. My mother was at a gala, leaving us to another night of forced normalcy. But everything had changed. The unspoken truth lingered between us, heavy and undeniable. We sat close, too close, the air thick with electricity. He turned to me, his eyes soft yet intense, and I couldn't look away. For a brief, charged moment, the space between us felt impossibly small, like we were teetering on the precipice of something irreversible. He didn't touch me, but his gaze was enough to set my heart racing. "I've been thinking about what we talked about," he said quietly, breaking the silence. I swallowed hard, bracing myself for a conversation we could no longer avoid. "Me too," I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. His hand rested on his knee, inches from mine. The slightest movement would have brought us into contact. The tension was suffocating, yet exhilarating. "We don't have to figure it all out right now," he said, his voice low and soothing. "But I think we both know this is different. Different." The word resonated, perfectly capturing the slow but steady shift in our dynamic. It was unlike anything I'd ever experienced, yet felt strangely natural, as if it had always been there, waiting to emerge. "I know," I replied softly, staring at my hands as if they held the answers. "But what do we do about it?" He hesitated, his eyes reflecting his own internal struggle. For the first time, I realized he wasn't in control, that we were both caught in something neither of us fully understood. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice vulnerable, "but we'll figure it out together." Together. The word offered a strange comfort, despite the fear that accompanied it. This wasn't just a fleeting feeling. It had the power to change everything. And a part of me, a terrifying part, wanted to see where it would lead. As time went on, our dynamic continued to evolve. We sought each other out, finding excuses to be alone. Long drives, late-night talks, shared silences. An undercurrent of tension always simmered beneath the surface, unspoken but palpable in our glances, our body language, the quiet moments we shared. One night, everything came to a head. My mother was out of town on business, leaving my father and me alone for the weekend. It was the perfect storm. No distractions, no interruptions, just the two of us and the mounting tension we could no longer ignore. We'd just finished dinner, and I was cleaning up the kitchen when he entered. He leaned against the counter, watching me with that familiar, thrilling gaze. "You don't have to do that," he said softly, his voice gentle yet firm. I shrugged, feigning indifference despite my racing heart. "It's no big deal. I'm almost done." He stepped closer, the air between us thickening. The room felt smaller, the space between us shrinking. "Come on," he said, his voice a low murmur. "Let's just relax. You've been working all day." I hesitated, but his gaze was irresistible. I dried my hands and followed him into the living room. He sat on the couch, leaving just enough space for me beside him. It was an unspoken invitation, and I accepted without hesitation. We sat in silence, the TV a meaningless background hum. I felt his warmth beside me, his presence overwhelming. I wanted to say something, too. I remained silent, unsure of what to say, letting the quiet anticipation fill the room. Whatever was about to transpire felt inevitable. He shifted slightly, his arm brushing against mine, sending a jolt of electricity through me. My breath hitched, and I turned to meet his gaze. We stared at each other, the unspoken tension palpable, hanging heavy in the air. No words were necessary. In that silence, everything was understood. We both acknowledged the unspoken truth that had been building for weeks. Then, without a word, his hand reached out, resting gently on my knee. The touch was tentative, a question posed without words. I didn't recoil. Instead, I allowed the moment to stretch, the weight of his hand a tangible presence. In that instant, something shifted between us. The barrier that had held us back crumbled, leaving no possibility of retreat. I glanced down at his hand, my heart pounding, then back up at him. His expression was soft, vulnerable. A side of him I'd never seen before, intensifying the moment. The air crackled with unspoken desire. "We don't have to," he began, but I interrupted. "I know," I whispered, my voice barely audible, "but I want to." Despite the fear, the truth was undeniable. I desired him in a way I couldn't comprehend, and in that moment, nothing else mattered. Not the confusion, the fear, or the uncertainty of the future. Only the two of us, here and now. He didn't respond verbally, but the look in his eyes spoke volumes. He leaned closer, his hand still on my knee, his breath warm against my skin. The room seemed to dissolve, leaving only the two of us in this charged, intimate space. Just as the tension reached its peak, he pulled back, his hand leaving my knee. The spell was broken. The moment lingered, unanswered, hanging in the air like a question. "I'm sorry," he murmured, his voice soft with regret. "I shouldn't have—" I shook my head, cutting him off. "No," I said firmly. "Don't apologize. We both know this isn't just nothing." That night felt different from the start. Even before anything happened, a palpable tension hung in the air, a culmination of weeks of unspoken desire. My father was unusually quiet at dinner, his gaze lingering on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I couldn't decipher the emotion in his eyes, guilt, longing, or something else entirely, but it was suffocating. We were both waiting, poised on the edge of something inevitable. We'd danced around the truth for weeks, sharing moments too charged to ignore, yet pretending nothing had changed. But it had. Tonight, the pretense was unsustainable. After dinner, he suggested a movie. I agreed, my mind too preoccupied with him to focus on the screen. We settled on the couch, the familiar tension returning, thick and unavoidable. The TV flickered, a meaningless distraction. My focus was solely on him, on the undeniable shift in our dynamic. At some point, he shifted closer, his arm brushing against mine, sending shivers down my spine. The seemingly innocent contact was loaded with meaning. My heart raced, my breath quickened. He felt it too. He was no longer watching the movie. He reached over, his hand resting on my knee. A gesture that could have been paternal on any other night. But tonight, it was different. His fingers lingered, pressing into my skin, and I didn't pull away. I let my hand cover his, a silent acceptance. The room seemed to shrink, every other sound fading away, leaving only the two of us suspended in a moment that felt both dangerous and inevitable. His fingers tightened around mine, a silent acknowledgement. He looked at me, his eyes filled with fear, hesitation, and a darker emotion I'd never seen before. We stared at each other, the space between us charged with a tension that felt ready to snap. "I don't want to hurt you," he whispered, his voice rough and low. I didn't know how to respond. I didn't want him to stop, didn't want to break the spell. I shook my head. "You won't," I whispered back, though I wasn't certain it was true. He hesitated, as if weighing the consequences. Then slowly, hesitantly, he leaned in, his lips brushing mine softly, tentatively. It wasn't what I expected, yet it was precisely what I'd been longing for. All the unspoken tension, the suppressed emotions, found release in that delicate kiss. It was brief, a whisper of contact, but enough to ignite a fire within me. He pulled back slightly, searching my eyes for confirmation, for a sign that I reciprocated his desire. I didn't hesitate. I leaned in, closing the distance, this time with certainty. The kiss deepened, growing more urgent, more insistent. His hands cupped my face gently, yet there was nothing gentle about the kiss itself. It was filled with a raw hunger I'd never sensed from him before. My hands moved to his chest, feeling the solid weight of his body beneath my fingertips. He was so close, so real, yet the moment felt surreal, like a dream. As the kiss intensified, everything else faded away. There was no more hesitation, no uncertainty, only the two of us, entangled on the couch, lost in a moment that felt both forbidden and necessary. His hands slid from my face, down my neck, lower, his touch igniting every nerve ending. We broke apart, gasping for air, his forehead resting against mine, his breath warm and unsteady against my skin. For a fleeting moment, I thought he might pull away, pretend it never happened. But then his hands were on me again, more insistent, more confident, and I didn't want him to stop. "Are you sure?" he whispered, his voice barely audible, his eyes locked on mine. I nodded, unable to speak, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't care about the consequences. I wanted this, wanted him, with a terrifying and undeniable certainty. My hands found their way to his back, pulling him closer, needing to feel him against me. The world outside ceased to exist. There was only this moment, this impossible, undeniable connection. His lips moved from my mouth, trailing down my neck, sending shivers through me. I arched against him, my breath coming in short gasps. I'd never experienced such intensity, such raw need. Yet it felt right, as if everything had been leading to this moment. He pulled back, his eyes dark with a mixture of desire, fear, and guilt. But it wasn't enough to stop him, nor did I want it to. I followed his lead, shedding my shirt without a second thought. The space between us disappeared, our bodies pressed together in a way that felt both foreign and completely natural. Every touch, every kiss, every movement was electric, as if we were on the verge of something dangerous, something neither of us had anticipated. Yet we didn't pull back. We couldn't. We were too far gone, lost in the moment. Then, all at once, the tension snapped, and we were consumed by each other. I couldn't distinguish where I ended and he began. We moved together as one. For a long time, we lay entangled, the room silent except for our ragged breaths slowly returning to normal. Words were unnecessary. In the quiet, we both knew everything had changed irrevocably. This wasn't something we could undo, could pretend hadn't happened. We had crossed a line, a point of no return. He shifted beside me, gently brushing a strand of hair from my face. His touch was tender, almost reverent. For the first time, I felt a flicker of fear, not of him, but of the unknown future. We lay in the quiet aftermath, the room still and warm, the air thick with the intimacy of what we'd done. I could feel the steady rise and fall of his chest beneath me, his breathing soft and shallow. There was nothing to say, no words to adequately capture the intensity of what had transpired. I exhaled, my fingers still curled around his arm, reluctant to break the fragile stillness. His hand rested on my back, steady and reassuring, yet I sensed a new tension in his muscles, a hesitation that hadn't been there before. I should have felt guilt, shame, but instead, a strange calm enveloped me. It was as if we were in our own world, hidden from reality. I knew the feeling couldn't last, that the real world would intrude soon enough. But for now, it was just us, and that was enough. Then, a soft creak, barely perceptible, sent a chill down my spine. My body stiffened. It came from the hallway. At first, I dismissed it as my imagination, a product of the paranoia that had been lurking at the edge of my awareness since... But then I heard it again, louder this time, the distinct sound of a door opening, followed by soft, deliberate footsteps. My heart stopped. I pushed myself up slightly, my body turning cold as the realization hit me. My mother. She was supposed to be out. But the sound of those footsteps was undeniable, and they were getting closer. Panic surged through me, icy and overwhelming. I turned to my father, my eyes wide with fear. Confusion flickered across his face for a moment before the reality of the situation registered. He sat up abruptly, pulling the blanket over us in a futile attempt to erase what had just happened. The room was suffocatingly quiet as we waited, frozen, for the inevitable. Then, the door opened. There she stood, her face a mask of shock and horror, freezing time itself. My mother, the woman who had given me life, raised me, trusted me, stood there staring at us with an expression I'll never forget. For a moment, no one moved, no one breathed. The air was thick with a gut-wrenching silence. I could see her trying to process the scene before her, her mind struggling to comprehend the unimaginable. Her eyes darted between us, taking in every awful detail, every truth laid bare. The confusion morphed into something far worse. Her face crumpled, her lips parting as if to speak, but no words came out. She just stared, her hands trembling. "Mom," I whispered, my voice barely audible, but the sound seemed to break her trance. Her eyes locked onto mine, the betrayal in them a physical blow. She didn't speak at first, just stood there, her entire body shaking uncontrollably. Then slowly, she took a step forward, her gaze never leaving mine. Tears welled in her eyes, her lips quivering as she struggled to form words. How could you?" she finally choked out, her voice breaking. I had no answer. My throat constricted, my chest aching under the weight of her devastation. I glanced at my father, hoping he would intervene, stop this nightmare from unfolding further. But he was frozen, his face pale, his eyes wide with guilt and fear mirroring my own. My mother's gaze darted between us again, her breath coming in ragged gasps. You're my son," she whispered, her voice thick with disbelief. "My own son." I wanted to say something, anything, to make it better, but there were no words to fix this. The reality of our actions was out in the open, inescapable. My father shifted beside me, reaching out as if to comfort her, but she recoiled instantly, her face contorted with disgust. "Don't touch me," she spat, her voice sharp and venomous. "Don't you dare touch me." He dropped his hand, his expression crumbling under the weight of her rejection. For a long moment, none of us spoke. The silence was suffocating. I could hear my own heart pounding, drowning out everything else. Tears streamed down her face, her body trembling as she fought to compose herself. I don't understand," she sobbed, her voice cracking. "How could you do this? How could you both do this to me?" Her words cut through me like a knife. I'd never seen her like this, so broken, so shattered. I'd always perceived her as strong, capable of handling anything. But now, she looked like a ghost of herself, fragile and lost. My father finally spoke, his voice shaky and filled with guilt. I'm sorry, he stammered. I never wanted to hurt you. Sorry? She repeated, her voice rising with disbelief. You're sorry? That's all you have to say? I could see the rage building within her, her hands clenching into fists, her knuckles white. She wasn't just angry, she was devastated. The betrayal was etched on her face, and there was nothing we could do to undo it. She stepped back, her eyes narrowing as she looked at us, as if we were strangers. You're both disgusting, she spat, her voice trembling with fury. I trusted you. I trusted you both. And this is how you repay me? My chest tightened, the guilt suffocating me. I'd never seen her so hurt, so utterly destroyed. I wanted to explain, but the words wouldn't come. I can't, she began, her voice breaking. I can't even look at you. She turned away, her hands covering her face as she sobbed, the sound tearing through the room, filling the silence with unbearable pain. My stomach twisted, and I felt. My father stood up, his movements slow and hesitant, and took a step toward her. Please, he said, his voice trembling, let's just talk about this. But she didn't look at him, didn't even acknowledge him. She just shook her head, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs, as she backed toward the door. I don't want to hear it, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I don't want to hear anything from either of you. And then she was gone. The door slammed shut behind her, the sound echoing through the room like a final, devastating blow. I sat there, frozen, my body numb, my mind reeling from the weight of what had just happened. My father stood motionless, staring at the door as if in disbelief. The silence that followed was unbearable. I wanted to scream, to cry, to do anything to release the crushing pain, but I was paralyzed. We were trapped in the reality of our actions, and there was no escape. I didn't respond. I couldn't. My mind was spinning, my heart aching with the weight of our betrayal. I couldn't stop replaying the look on her face, the devastation in her eyes, a permanent reminder of what we had destroyed. For what felt like hours, we sat in silence, the weight of our actions suffocating us. There was no going back, no fixing this. The damage was done, and the fallout was something we would have to live with forever. I don't know how we move forward from this, my father said quietly, his voice breaking the silence. I didn't know either. In the silence that followed, the weight of everything pressed down on us, leaving a void that no words could fill. We had crossed a line, an irreversible act, and the consequences would follow us forever. The echoes of that moment, my mother's devastated face, the thick air of betrayal, would haunt us. Our lives had changed irrevocably, and though we sat together in that empty room, the distance between us felt immense. I didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. There was no going back.